Right.
Welcome to the AIER's Authors Corners podcast. I'm your host, Ethan Yang, and today our guest is Phil Magness. He's a senior fellow here at AIER. When we're both in the office, his office is about 50 feet away from my desk, so this conversation should be a little bit more casual, I'm hoping. But the topic today is actually a pretty big one: critical race theory, intersectionality. What were once fringe academic ideas are now being discussed with real seriousness in classrooms across America, as well as corporate boardrooms across the country as well. It's no longer just an academic idea, it's a real force that needs to be reckoned with right now. And so today we're hoping to talk to Phil about this topic. He's certainly an expert. He's published many books as well as articles on topics like this, and we're hoping that we can get a little bit more information from him. So without further ado, Phil, how are you doing?
Too bad.
Great. So just to start off, let's first talk about this article that you wrote for Cato Unbound. If you're listening, you should certainly go and look up this article. It's a great read. It's titled, "Does Classical Liberalism Need Intersectionality Theory?" So can you walk us through that? What is intersectionality first and foremost? You talk about two types in your article, elementary and compound. So can you give us a little bit more information on these two types of intersectionality theories?
Right. So intersectionality is a framework for thinking about forms of social interaction. And it's related to various aspects that all individuals have. They're members of a variety of different groups. Where it originated, there was an article written in the late 1980s by a legal scholar named Kimberly Crenshaw, where she first proposed the idea. And in its simplest form, it's pretty straightforward. She uses a traffic intersection, which is really the source of the name for it, and says, when cars meet in a traffic intersection, they're coming at each other from multiple directions. And not only are they crossing paths and watching the lights change and everything, but occasionally there are conflicts. There's collisions. So two cars may enter in the intersection at the same time, and the collision occurs. And metaphorically, this is also something that she sees in social interactions, is a collision not only has direct effects from the physical properties that collide with each other, but there's compounding effects that follow from that interruption of the normal traffic flow. So she uses this as kind of a mental model for thinking about social interactions. In the simplest, most elementary form of an intersectional interaction, asserts that when there are multiple social identities at play in the way that two or more human beings interact with each other, this could be anything from race, class, gender, religion, sexuality, politics, ethnicity, historical background, country of origin, you name it, all the different social identities that could exist. What this means is that when two or more of these are present, it produces modes of experience that are different from if any one of these identities alone were viewed in isolation in a conversation. So the example she gives is an African-American person could experience racism in isolation. A female person could experience sexism in isolation, but an African-American female, there's a compounding effect to where it's not just racism and sexism that are experienced individually. It's rather a cumulative effect of both of these terms interacting at the same point. So this is her attempt to explain what's going on there. And then she starts to look at things like power dynamics of where a person stands in their social status that's wrapped up in not only just one, but multiple different categories of identity. So the really simplistic, basic 30,000 foot overview form, the elementary form, what I call it in this article, is basically just a descriptive observation. It says that a rightly understood intersectional interaction is one where you have compounding effects based on the identity groups of the participants in that interaction. So in other words, it's like a qualitative way of saying something like multivariate statistical regression would attempt to do in teasing out the interaction of multiple variables, but here we're doing it socially. I don't really take issue with this form of intersectionality analysis. I think it's an intuition that human beings have had for time immemorial. It long predates the coining of the term in an article in 1989. People have thought about how interactions occur when the parties are of different races, different ethnicities, different backgrounds, religions, and then how those things compound when you combine them together, especially in historically discriminatory circumstances. But I also don't think it's all that of a profound insight. So this is something that's generated tens of thousands of academic articles. It's one of the most trendy things that's talked about in academia. But it's also kind of like a banality in observing that, yes, social categories interact with each other in compounding ways. It's true, but it's not something that's like a huge game-changing insight to recognize this. This is something that almost any person with a head on his or her shoulders can intuit. But that's kind of where intersectionality analysis ceases to be useful to me, is when it jumps into what I call the compound form. And the compound form takes that basic framework, but it starts to attach and import political ideas. And it's a very particular set of political ideas that are associated generally on the far left. Some of them are Marxist in origin or derivative of Marxism. There's a general hostility to free market capitalism. There's a general hostility to institutions such as private property and money that are associated with capitalism. And what they do is they'll assert that intersectionality explains a social disparity in compound interactions between people that belong across all these group lines, and then they kind of do the hand waving trick and say, and therefore capitalism is wrong, or capitalism's perpetuating these institutions. So it really kind of jumps the shark as a concept all the way back in Crenshaw's original article and a follow-up essay she wrote in 1990, where she just basically declares that she's taking this very simple concept and turning it into a more complex tool for social political activism and political activism on explicit group identity lines. She's saying that this concept she's proposed is not only true in itself as an analytical tool, it's also valuable to enlist essentially and to weaponize into far left political activism. And unfortunately, I think that's where you get the majority of what comes in academia using intersectionality analysis. It's this compound form that is really just an attempt to bludgeon disliked ideas out of the political arena by calling them racist, sexist, and other horrible bigotries.
So let's dive a little bit deeper into that second form, intersectionality. So we've established that intersectionality is traditionally defined as a pretty common sense idea. But this compound intersectionality you've mentioned in your article has been used to justify attacks against classical thinkers like Hayek or Milton Friedman. You mentioned they've also used it to go after public choice theory, which is just basically saying that government institutions function just like private institutions, where there's people that are self-interested. It's pretty benign idea, but under the lens of compound intersectionality, these ideas of markets, of limited government, what have you, are now racist and are worth politically contesting under this traditionally academic framework. So can you explain how they've jumped from certain types of minorities feel certain different types of pressure to capitalism and markets are racist?
Yeah. Well, I'll read you a quote from Kimberly Crenshaw's most recent book, where she really kind of frames this up. The compound intersectionality ideas jump into an attack on politically disliked ideas from her far left perspective. And she writes, quote, "The emergence of economics as a discipline suppressed the study of socially constructed institutions by reducing human behavior to, quote, the sum total of autonomous actions by universally interchangeable, rational, and self-interested acquisitive subjects." So they're really big on like jargony descriptions of simple things. But she's basically saying that private property here is motivated by self-interest, and economics operates as a discipline to suppress socially constructed institutions that might interact with private property in a different way. So it's basically this gigantic caricature of what economics is all about, but she jumps right from there to asserting that public choice theory is rooted in building up like an esoteric defense of economics from critical race theory and from intersectionality analysis to preserve the hegemony of private property, and private property itself in turn services white supremacy, services bigotry, services discrimination in an institutionalized form. So what she's done is she's taking just the very existence of discrimination in its simple form, including the complexities of how discrimination plays out, and then infused it with a very heavy, prejudicial, uncharitable, ideological description of what economics is all about. And basically you get to a conclusion that that economics and free enterprise and private property are just tools of oppression, and tools of oppression rooted toward white supremacy. So it's a real leap of logic. And there's not really much of an evidentiary record that would connect that early starting premise of compounding effects of social categories to this conclusion that therefore capitalism is racist and evil and private property is racist and evil. And yet that's the conclusion that they end on. And it's a recurring theme in this type of literature.
So do you think there's a sort of convenient intersection or alliance between the critical race theorists and the economic Marxists? Like two things that should be two different topics, but now it's kind of fused together to become just one big umbrella.
Right. I broaden that even not just Marxist, but I'd say certain heterodox schools of economics on the far left. Because Marxism has multiple iterations. I mean, it's one of the most schismatic ideologies you could ever imagine, which is why whenever there's a Marxist society, they break up into Bolsheviks and Mensheviks and start shooting each other. That's kind of the way it goes. So there are many, many different claimants to Marx. Critical theory itself, I would consider something like a grandchild of Marxism, an intellectual grandchild of Marxism, in the sense that it draws on a lot of the same concepts, but it supplants Marxian class analysis with racial and religious and ethnic and gender identity group analysis. So that's what you get in as like this core building block. But when it starts interacting with economics as a discipline, well, what do we know about economics? The mainline and mainstream of the discipline pretty resoundingly rejected Marxist style analysis back in the late 19th century, really. It's not something that's considered part of the mainstream of the discipline. And as a result, there are other heterodox camps that derive from Marxist analysis that are also very much on the fringe of the discipline. What intersectionality analysis and critical theory have done in attacking economics outright as a discipline, they're basically trying to say, well, we've lost the battle internal to economics on intellectual debate. These ideas really never took root as the core of the discipline. So therefore, we're going to attack the discipline itself as racist, sexist, bigoted, and use that as a way to reassert these outside external economic theories that are actually pretty fringe.
And so moving on to another big point you bring up. So you mentioned, they want to shift this debate to calling markets and limited government racist and sexist. And that's all fine and dandy. I'm happy to have that debate. But you mentioned that one part of critical theory, and then I guess compound intersectionality by relation, is that there's an important framework that really stamps out all debate when it comes to dealing with this academic discipline. You've mentioned there is a lack of falsifiability and obscurity that comes with critical race theory. And there's also a form of epistemic aristocracy where only certain people may have insight onto certain issues. So can you give examples of what these two basic prongs of the framework look like, and why is this problematic?
Yeah. So a good way to think about critical race theory and most critical theories in general is they adopt a style of analysis that is simultaneously obscurantist, in the sense that it operates in like a proprietary set of jargon and concepts that are almost intentionally removed from accessibility to the normal person. In other words, to read through these articles, you have to familiarize yourself with dozens of proprietary terms and almost neologisms. Intersectionality itself is a neologism that's created specifically for this concept, and it's one of the easier and more common ones that you encounter. But you read this literature; it's some of the densest, most jargon-laced stuff that you'll ever encounter, and yet this obscurantist language style is often obscuring some very banal, mundane observations overlaid with a lot of political fluff. I mean, there's just really not much rigor or substance there. And what I argue here is that this is intentional. This is something that's done using a mode of analysis, a mode of philosophical argumentation that tries to intentionally obscure or deflect serious substantive scrutiny of the claim that's being made. So the philosopher Harry Frankfurt calls this by the moniker bullshit. And he's talking about not in the profane term, he's talking about bullshit in as a philosophical category of argumentation. And what he uses bullshit to describe is not deception in the outright sense of saying a falsehood, but when you see someone and you say, hey, this person's bullshitting, what they're trying to do is lead you on a line of analysis that they don't really believe themselves, or that obscures you from the aim of getting to the truth of what you're trying to analyze. So it's a communication mechanism to deflect, and you see this very heavily in the critical race theory literature. They use linguistic tools and jargon to deflect scrutiny. They dress up what are really simplistic arguments that probably wouldn't withstand a lot of rigorous analysis in heavy terminology and appeals to obscure citations. And what that does is it makes it all that much harder for anyone who disagrees with them to actually even get into the weeds and critique it. So that's the first half. That's the obscurantism. The epistocracy, and this is a term I borrow from my friend and philosopher Jason Brennan. He uses it in his work. What's an epistocracy? It's governance by the learned. It's governance by those who have access to a certain level of knowledge. Now he uses it in a very different context than the what I'd say exists in the critical theory world. But the critical theory version of epistocracy means basically that you trained in graduate school under another critical theorist, who trained under another critical theorist. So there's an intellectual genealogy that goes back to someone who is quote unquote approved or seen as suitably versed in the critical theory world to be able to comment on it. And you see this in the types of arguments that they wage. If you're trained in critical theory and you adhere to that mode of analysis, it also means normally that you agree with its politics. Those are part and parcel of the same thing. So people that studied under a famous critical theorist emerge not only using this mode of analysis, but sharing the same ideas, sharing the same political priors and ideological commitments. So the epistocratic side of critical theory essentially judges arguments based on whether they're in agreement with critical theory conclusions on ideological matters. When you do that, what it basically means is that anyone who disagrees with critical theory conclusions is by definition outside of the epistocracy. They're outside of the conversation. They aren't properly trained because they haven't come to the conclusion that's desired and specified by the critical theory ideological commitment. Therefore, they are wrong. You merge these things together. It basically serves as a defense mechanism to make critical theory to remove it from being accessible to outside analysis. So either you're a critical theorist who works in obscurantist jargon and who accepts the epistocratic priors of critical theory, or you're outside of that realm and therefore are wrong. And by being wrong, that also means you're racist, bigoted, sexist, homophobic, and all the other things that they like to accuse anyone that disagrees with them of.
And let's kind of tie that into another area of expertise, which is you do a lot of work on higher education, especially studying it from a more economic standpoint. And right now, I'm sure everyone has been seeing the news, and there's plenty of, it's pretty much a punching bag at this point. But the most progressive and elite universities in the world are right here in the United States. Yet they've also had, these rampant claims of racism and sexism, and student bodies are rising up and demanding more diversity infrastructure and things of that sort. But at the same time, like you mentioned, anyone who questions them, maybe anyone who says, oh, maybe that's not a good investment, maybe we should focus more on something else, would be deemed racist and whatnot. So in your eyes, do you see this as a healthy dynamic as it's surging through higher ed at the rate that it's going? And do you think that the people who are behind this actually understand the consequences of what could actually come out of this?
Yeah. So higher ed is in some very difficult straits at the moment. This is an empirical fact as well as something that we can observe through anecdotes and all the craziness we hear in news stories. And the empirical fact I'll give you is we can see it in surveys of the political dynamics of the American professoriate. And the basic story is that as far back as we have data on this goes to the 1960s, there used to always be kind of a center-left plurality in higher ed. So most professors were left of center, but in the old liberal sense. So if you can imagine, like the university system divided, where 45% are left of center, and the remaining 55%, about half of that are self-described moderates, and the other half are conservatives. That was the dynamic that existed from about the mid-1960s to really the late 1990s, early 2000s. It was a stable thing. And we see this year after year after year in all these surveys that were conducted, that the breakdown is basically that. There's a plurality that's left of center, and then the remainder is between moderates and conservatives. After the early 2000s, something shifted, something changed. The academy started hiring professors at a much, much higher rate on the left, and especially the far left. You can look at the surveys, and people that identified as like Marxists and other really, really far left ideologies jumped from like 3 or 4% of the professoriate up to about 12 to 14%, I think is the most recent surveys. So it basically tripled to quadrupled. Depending on how you look at it, over a very short period of time, maybe 15 to 20 years. And at the same time, non-left voices started to shrink. So both moderates and conservatives have been in decline, whereas the liberal left, the center left, has also tended to grow. So what you have on the whole is we're now reaching a point where there's a supermajority of faculty, well upwards of 60%, that identify on either the left or the far left. And that's historically unprecedented because it's kind of squeezed out all other aspects of political diversity in most intellectual discussions. It's the most pronounced in the humanities, but we're also seeing it starting to take over other areas of the academy. So when I say 60% of all professors are now of the left, if you go to the English department, it's something like 90% of all professors are of the left. Same with the history department. This is just an empirical fact. It's not an observation of whether this is a good or a bad thing. We can get into why it's a problematic thing, but it's a historical fact that that's the shift that's occurred. As you noted, at the same time, as the academies moved further and further to the left, we've also seen much more more examples in the news of these incidents of people basically accusing the academy itself of being an institution, a bastion of racism. And I'm mixed in what to make of these claims, because on the one hand, the academy is probably the most progressive institution of our society on an empirical basis. It's very much of the far left. It's people that subscribe to a lot of these theories. And yet at the same time, it has it's home to some of the most vocal expressions of accusations that systemic racism is present within the academy itself, sexism, all of the other bigotries that we rightfully denounce are said to be institutionalized into the very same academy that subscribes to the political views that claim to be most aggressively opposed to this. So something's not adding up here. This is the question that I'd ask. Why is the most progressive area of society also the one, the home of the most pervasive and visible problems of bigotry, discrimination, and racism, at least according to the rhetoric? And that says either they aren't accurately representing what's going on in the academy, or maybe critical theory and some of these other parallel ideologies themselves are actually inculcators of bigotry. And I would argue that there are probably elements of both that are playing out in higher ed right now.
And as people from higher ed graduate into the corporate sector, and we've all, this, I think 2020 especially is where we've seen consequences of what basically the critical race theory infiltration into the corporate sector at large. But how do you see this playing out, I guess, from an economic standpoint, when people look at colleges and they see, they see how far left the faculty is getting, and they look at corporations and they see the way they're acting? How do you think the backlash, if any, would come to this more, I guess, from like a more market-based perspective? Like, how's the general population going to take this?
Yeah, so if you read the higher ed literature, you see these buzzwords that pop up, and one of them that you always hear about is, well, our universities are being corporatized, our universities are being turned into corporations. And I liken it to, there was that movie the South Park creators made called Team America, where they had, I think it was Sean Penn as the little puppet comes up and gives like a speech to one of the media guys, and he says, well, the corporations are being all corporation-y in their corporate buildings because they want to profit. And it's like this ridiculous line of argument that makes no sense, but that's actually believed about the universities. So the universities are being corporatized. What I would say is it's actually the opposite that's taking place. The corporations are being universitized. They're being infused with a lot of these ideas that are spilling over out of the intellectual sphere and into traditionally companies and areas of the economy that were not only not involved in politics, they were apolitical. They were focused on producing things that people want and providing services that people want. That's the basis of economic exchange. But now you have elements of corporations are expected to be quote unquote socially responsible, or if you want to use the colloquial version, they're expected to be woke. And next thing you know, you've got Facebook very aggressively indulging in adding little disclaimers and ads for certain political perspectives. You have Twitter censoring disliked political views. You have major corporations announcing social justice activist campaigns that are completely unrelated to the service that they're providing. Completely unrelated to their product, but that they want to signal a very visible political stance. And what this has done is it's politicized elements of society that used to be generally removed from that arena and much more peaceful because they were removed from that arena. This is not a popular development, as we're seeing in a lot of the social division and tension that emerges from it. A lot of people that feel excluded by these political ideas. In other words, anyone to the right of Karl Marx or Joseph Stalin and some of these expressions feels excluded from this far left version of political ideology. That is a recipe for you're going to start seeing some pressures to do things like defund universities. You're going to start seeing budget items come up that go on the chopping block that maybe 20 or 30 years ago were seen as a general public investment. Because, higher ed was always sold to the public as, well, we need to do this. We need to spend money on this, including tax dollars, because we want our children to grow up and be successful and innovate and invent new things, new technologies, make scientific discoveries. That's the quote unquote public good basis that university funding is sold on. We can debate whether that's a legitimate claim, but that's always what the rhetoric is. And yet, if it turns out that universities are not pursuing knowledge and scientific discovery and innovation, but rather are just generating political activists and far left political activists, the question starts to be asked: should we continue funding this at the public expense? Another way to think of it, and I'll borrow from James Buchanan, the economist. He observed a great little essay back in the 1970s that the average university faculty views his or her relationship with the public, with the taxpayer, as if the taxpayer should walk up to the ivy wall and just toss bags of money over it, having no say and asking no questions about what's done with that money when it lands on the other side. And this is a completely unreasonable way to do public finance. And yet that's basically how the university is operating as it moves in a more overtly political direction. Sooner or later, the taxpayers are going to wake up to that and realize, hey, wait a minute, we're throwing money over the wall and it's actually being spent on all sorts of crazy, dubious, unscholarly, unrigorous enterprises that seem to be also now spilling over into society in the form of politicizing everything. That's when you start to turn off the spigot of taxpayer funding.
So I'd like to wrap this up by bringing it back to your Cato article. And it's, I guess, the ultimate question is that, the United States and our classical liberal tradition is one built on individuality and individual rights, and it's fundamentally opposed to racism. And obviously, we still have plenty of work to do to really realize that vision for everybody. So the question is this critical race theory, compound intersectionality theory, for classical liberals, people who believe in individual rights and freedom, is this something to keep in the toolbox of analysis, or is this an idea that just needs to be tossed into the dustbin of history?
So I opened my article with a quote, and this is from the British Member of Parliament, the great liberal Whig Charles James Fox, and it's considered, and it's from a very famous speech he gave. It's considered like the classical formulation of classical liberal concepts of tolerance. And Fox notes that persecution always says, I know the consequences of your opinion better than you know them yourselves. But the language of toleration is the language of amicable, liberal, and just. And it confesses its doubts and acknowledges its ignorance. It's an expression of epistemic humility, not epistemic certainty. So classical liberal toleration, which I would argue is as much a core value to our tradition as free markets, private property, rule of law, all of the freedom of exchange, all of the other precepts. So the classical liberal concept of toleration is almost Hayekian in its expression. It's an assertion that it's precisely because we do not know things that we should proceed with caution. We should proceed recognizing that ignorance is the human condition, and ignorance itself is limiting on what you can plow ahead and try to do in socially designing society. Well, what do you get in the critical race theory realm? What do you get in intersectionality analysis? It's quite the opposite of that. They are asserting access to an achromatically delivered truth. A truth that comes from being trained in the critical theory tradition, being trained in intersectionality, and being accessible only to persons that fall into the certain categories of analysis that intersectional assessments would permit. These are very bold, not epistemically humble statements of any sort. And I'd argue just based on that ground alone, they violate the precept of toleration as a philosophical core to understanding something. So what does this mean for a classical liberal? It's not only that we should reject critical theory analysis, we do in fact have better modes of analysis from the liberal tradition to tackle some of the very same problems, to tackle racism, to tackle sexism, to tackle bigotry. And this goes all the way back into the very same tradition that bred free markets and led to the emergence of liberal enlightenment was the philosophical tradition that ended slavery, that birthed abolitionism. They were two paired causes in the 19th century together that go all the way back to Adam Smith himself, but also follow through his successors. In other words, there are other modes of analysis for tackling the very real problems of discriminatory injustice. And unfortunately, what critical race theory has done is it's moved into that realm of discussion and it's crowded out better explanations, more rigorous explanations that actually do get to the source of the problem.
Well, thank you, Phil, for very eloquent and very insightful words. I'm sure this topic will be a very important conversation going forward. I think this is certainly the beginning, nowhere near close to the end. To our listeners, if you liked what you heard, please feel free to keep up with AIER's content on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, as well as our website, aier.org. If you really liked what you heard, please consider donating to support our mission so we can turn out more great content through podcasts as well as our editorial, which I'm sure everyone is already well aware of. Otherwise, please stay tuned for our next guest. Thank you.